Right now, I do want to take a live look over Washington, D.C. and the White House as the war of words does continue between Presidents Trump and Putin, as well as other U.S. and Russian officials. President Trump appearing to give the Russian president 2 weeks to work out a deal to end the 3-year war with Ukraine. Trump recently calling Putin crazy and saying that he's playing with fire. Now, speaking from the White House Wednesday, Trump was asked about his fractured relationship with Putin, and here is what he had to say.
When they say that your criticisms of Putin are simply an emotional response, and do you still believe that Putin actually wants to end the war?
I can't tell you that, but I'll let you know in about 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, we're going to find out very soon. We're going to find out whether or not he's tapping us along or not. And if he is, we'll respond a little bit differently, but it'll take about a week and a half, 2 weeks. We have Mr. Witkoff is here, is doing a phenomenal job, is dealing with them very strongly right now. They seem to want to do something, but until the document is signed, I can't tell you. Nobody can. I can say this. I can say this, that I'm very disappointed at what happened a couple of nights now where people were killed in the middle of what you would call a negotiation. I'm very disappointed by that.
And this right here is just some of the video of what the president is talking about there. Ukrainian officials saying that Russia launched its largest drone attack on Ukraine over the weekend. The Russian bombardment Sunday night included at least 355 drones. That is according to the Ukrainian Air Force. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenksyy adding that more than 900 drones were fired at his country over a 3-day period. Now, it's also important to note that after President Trump made those comments, we also heard from the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now a top Russian security official. He threatened the U.S., stating this could lead to World War III. A lot to discuss here, so I do want to bring in Dimitris Sarahas, a Virginia Tech foreign relations expert, visiting professor of political science, a lot of titles there. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us this morning.
Good morning, Josh. Thank you for having me.
Good morning. Well, first off, I do want to start by asking you about those World War III comments that were made by the former president of Russia. He is now a top security official there in Moscow. So how much weight do those words really hold? Because you hear World War III, and that's obviously a threat to the U.S.
It's another one of the series of threats that Medvedev has sort of expressed over the last 3 years. Remember, at the beginning of the war, a similar rhetoric was coming from the Kremlin. Of course, Medvedev being the former Russian president, who became president when Putin switched over to become prime minister for a short while. So I don't think that this is particularly surprising, but it just denotes a change of tone on the part of how Moscow now sees Washington. They had stopped making these threats for a while, and of course there was a window of opportunity, particularly in the early days of the Trump administration, when the idea that Russia may be persuaded to change its ways appeared to be more viable. However, these threats seem to suggest that the talks that the president referred just there on your clip are not going the way that is envisaged. And of course, European unity behind Ukraine and additional US pressure now is making things a lot more difficult for the Kremlin. And I think this is one of the reasons why they feel the need to justify their actions by using a rhetoric that is obviously menacing and attempting to threaten or even blackmail the United States.
As we talk a little bit about these comments that have been made kind of back and forth between the U.S. and Russia, how has the relationship between President Trump here in the U.S. as well as President Putin over in Russia kind of changed over the last several days and really over the last several weeks?
You're right. It has changed, and it has changed quite dramatically. Remember that in the period before the election here in the United States in November, there were these sounds coming from the Kremlin about how future President Trump would be potentially a partner of Russia, and how a change in leadership in Washington would sort of facilitate the kind of resolution to the war that the Russians were claiming was very important to them. Now, I think what we have been able to observe is that President Trump himself has shifted his rhetoric over Putin. I think there was an idea or an assumption in the early days of the administration that coming to a resolution and starting off with a ceasefire that would then become a permanent sort of peace settlement would be pretty straightforward. And of course, we recall that in the early days, relations between President Trump and President Zelenksyy of Ukraine were characterized by a degree of tension, precisely because President Trump believed that he's the one who will make sure that a deal is made with Putin. Now, I think what has changed is the United States has come to realize that Putin is not necessarily interested in finishing this war, which remains the ultimate objective of the White House. And so the first 30-day ceasefire idea was undermined by the Russians. And I think what we have now is again an attempt to undermine the possibility of a lasting peace.
What are we talking about as far as red lines, things that both sides are not going to budge on? Of course, we're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about Russia. What are their red lines, so to speak?
I think it's quite clear that for the Ukrainians, if they stop fighting, and if they stop fighting particularly on the border with Russia, they have no country any longer. So for them, I think the idea is simply that you have to keep on fighting for as long as the United States and Europe stands behind you if you want to have any sort of viable exit strategy from this war, and of course rely on your partners in the West to negotiate with Putin or themselves to negotiate directly with Putin. There is a possibility of doing this in Istanbul, Turkey, coming up next week, in order to resolve this. For the Russians, it's quite clear that they do have the red lines, Josh, that you referred to right here. And they have to do, of course, with Ukraine's NATO accession first and foremost. Secondly, they have to do with the annexation of Crimea. I don't think Russia is willing to give back Crimea to the Ukrainian state. And it seems to me that this is something that President Trump himself has sort of tacitly acknowledged to be probably a line that the Russians will not cross. I think the real question is what happens on eastern Ukraine, how much of the territory which is currently under Russian occupation will be returned to the Ukrainians or not. I think this is really going to be a subject of a long-term peace settlement. And at the moment, all we have in front of us, once again, is probably the possibility of a fragile ceasefire.
And as we move forward, and you kind of touched on this here, where do things go from here? What is the next step in all of this as we wait for the next move? Of course, we're waiting to see if there will be any more ceasefire talks. We know that President Trump has given Putin essentially 2 weeks to make this happen. So what do we see happening here in the coming days and weeks?
I think that's a very good question. It's really up to American pressure, I think. If you look at what's happening on the battlefield, it's quite clear that none of the two sides is going to lose this comprehensively over the next 2 weeks. Everyone knows this. And of course, the Russians are not going to lose this. The Ukrainians are still able to resist, not least because the United States and, of course, the European Union countries and countries like Britain continue to support them militarily. So I don't think there's going to be anything happening on the military front. What may happen is in the diplomatic front that President Trump alluded to in the clip you played before. And essentially what this means is I think the United States is going to up the ante. The United States is going to put more pressure on Russia to come to the table with a serious proposal about a lasting ceasefire to start with, verify that there is going to be some mechanism that will allow for this ceasefire to last, as opposed to the previous ceasefire that collapsed almost immediately, and try really to make sure that the Russians are truthful to what they say. And if the United States and President Trump are convinced that Putin is serious about a ceasefire, then I think we can have more long-term discussions to finally lead to a lasting peace settlement, which, of course, would be in the interests of everyone involved.
And I do want to ask folks out there watching right now, we want to get their take. So you can scan the QR code here at the top right-hand side of your screen. These votes are coming in real time. But do you support the current level of U.S. involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? The options there: yes, it's appropriate; no, the U.S. should do more; and no, the U.S. should do less. Again, we want to get your take, so scan that QR code top right-hand side of your screen, or go to livenowfox.com/connect. We'll check on the results as they do come in real time. Right now, it looks like essentially the U.S. should do more is winning. But again, these votes are coming in, so it's kind of changing here on your screen as we get the results. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and discuss all of this further. Obviously, a lot to this, so we appreciate it. Anything else you want to add here before I let you go?
Thank you for having me, Josh. Just a very small thing to add here, looking at the poll you're running right now. It's good to remember that whether we believe that the US should do more or less in this war, it's very important to keep in mind that after January 2025, speaking about a lasting peace has become again an issue that everyone, including Europe and Ukraine, is now thinking about and is now trying to bring to the table. And I think that ultimately arriving at a peace settlement is in everyone's interest.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.